Hello, this is the next in a series of videos about the subject of divine providence, and this time we're going to take up the question of freedom. We've been talking about the Cold War, about how freedom and security are the two big preoccupations during the Cold War, and they're good themes to cover the subject of divine providence too. And the question of freedom is something that has always preoccupied Americans, and there's a paradoxical element of it. Did you know that if you have a lot of school children in a yard playing, and you have no boundary, no fence around the area, that the children will tend to huddle in the middle, and they'll be fairly quiet and not really having a lot of fun. But then if you put a fence up around it, the children will evidently have a greater feeling of freedom. And so it's one of the great paradoxes of human life that it's when we have some kind of structure, some understanding, it relates in this way to security, some foundation of security in our lives, that we in fact feel freer. And I want to mention also the tremendous connection between divine providence, that is God's purposes, God's design, and human freedom. When you look at the Bible, for instance, the Bible is not a book of theology so much as it's a history, a book of events. And what is the central event of the Old Testament? The Exodus, the tremendous liberation from slavery of the children of Israel. What is the central event of the New Testament? The resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that bridged the gap between an unholy God and an unholy humanity and a holy God, and liberating humanity from the burden of sin and self and sickness. Everything is really about human freedom in the best sense of that word, that is, from God's perspective. When you look at our own history, our greatest of presidents, Abraham Lincoln, in his greatest of public utterances, which is not really the Gettysburg Address so much as the second inaugural address. That's where he really reaches his highest point of effective rhetoric. And he says at one point, if every drop of blood drawn by the lash must be paid by a drop of blood drawn by the sword, shall we not discern his righteousness in this? Or he said, it said now as it was said long ago, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, quoting Psalm 119, making it very clear that he regarded the entire Civil War as God's purpose to free the slaves, even though he regarded his own role in it as saving the Republic. He was humble enough not to identify himself so closely with God's purposes as to sound like he thought of himself as an instrument of God. But he had the discernment to understand providence, which was a major theme in Lincoln's intellectual development, and to attribute the entire Civil War, with all the horrific suffering associated with it, to God's purposes. And so I would like to bring up another great historical event, one that shocked us so suddenly in 2001, the Trade Center attack. And I have a friend whose son was killed in that attack, and this friend went on to organize the 9/11 families. And so I called him shortly after the attack to extend my condolences about his son. And we got into an extended conversation in which I was talking about various historical things that were going on in the 80s and early 90s in Pakistan and Afghanistan that seemed to be a prelude to the attack. And he said, well, that's all very interesting. I'll tell you, we have a meeting coming up of 9/11 families, an organizing meeting. Now, this was just a very short time after the actual attack. And if you don't mind, why don't you come on over to this house in New Jersey where there'll be about 25 of us, and you can give a talk for a few minutes about these things, which I think they'll find interesting. So I did. I gave the talk over there, looking at an audience filled with people who had just lost a son or a brother or another relative. The whole country, as you remember, was traumatized. Well, you can only imagine how this particular group of people felt. And so after I finished that, someone raised his hand and asked a question that I was shocked by, because I would have thought he would have settled it in his mind during the ensuing weeks between the attack and this occasion. What he said in the most anguished sort of way was, "Why do they hate us?" And so I said, well, I'll offer an opinion about that. I'm sure there are others here that have an opinion, but there are a couple of things that come to mind. Certainly the Palestine-Israel conflict is involved in this, but there's another thing that's involved in this, which I believe even goes closer to the hearts of many of the people in those traditional societies. And if you can imagine saying this to that particular group, I said, there's an aspect of this in which I half sympathize with the attackers, and I'll tell you what it is. It's that we are exporting a degree of decadence in this country in the form of glamorizing violence and sexual chaos, and there are people over there that resent that to the point where we have become, in their minds, our enemy from we have become their enemy from the cultural point of view, and some of whom are willing to take violent action regarding that. By the way, nobody seemed to be offended or to, in fact, disagree with me on that point in that group. But the question goes to the one in which people will imagine that they just don't like to have freedom over there. And I don't think that's a full explanation. I think everybody likes freedom to a degree, but if they see that freedom is being abused and has become, among many in the West, a form of libertinism, then freedom itself does become something that's questioned. I'm not defending the kinds of actions that they would take to control things, covering women from head to toe, stoning people to death for adultery, and so forth. But they are dealing with the kinds of social threats that are real and not merely imagined. So there is a personal aspect of this, since we are all tempted by the kinds of things that we're talking about here from one degree or another. There is a personal aspect of this in which we have to recognize that our freedom must be balanced by the kind of discipline and sense of responsibility that would make that freedom valuable and real.